Ever feel like the state of modern democracy is a lot to unpack?
Yeah.
Well, today's deep dive might just hold the key. And the crazy part is, the answers might be found over 2,000 years in the past.
Wow.
We're taking a trip back to ancient Athens, guided by a fascinating episode of the Empires in Mirror podcast.
It's wild to think about it, but the Athenians were grappling with many of the same questions we have today. How to balance individual freedom with the common good.
Right.
How to ensure fairness, how to make government work for the people.
It makes you wonder, are we just destined to keep repeating history's mistakes?
Yeah.
Or can understanding Athenian democracy give us a leg up on the challenges our own democracies face? This podcast episode started in 5th century BC Athens. Picture yourself in the Agora, their bustling marketplace.
It wasn't just about buying olives and sandals, though. Imagine heated debates about philosophy and politics, all happening out in the open.
Wow.
This was a society where ordinary citizens, at least the men, had a direct say in how they were governed.
Wow, that's incredible.
Yeah.
But also kind of exclusive, right?
Absolutely. And the episode doesn't shy away from that.
Okay.
It was a democracy for the few, not the many. Women, slaves, foreigners, they were completely shut out of the decision-making process.
A good reminder that even societies considered advanced for their time had some pretty major blind spots.
Yeah.
So how does this Athenian system actually work?
Okay.
What made it so unique?
This is where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
Forget electing representatives.
Okay.
Athenians believed in direct power to the people.
Wow.
They called this the demos. They had regular assemblies where citizens could propose laws, debate them, and vote on them directly. They even used a lottery system to choose people for certain government positions just to make sure everyone had a chance.
Wow.
Can you imagine that happening today?
It's mind-blowing. Talk about a wild government experiment.
Yeah.
I mean, sure, it wasn't perfect, but you can see how that idea, everyday folks having real power, would be incredibly appealing even thousands of years later.
And the episode really drives that point home. Even with its flaws, Athenian democracy planted a powerful seed. That core belief in the potential for ordinary people to shape their own destiny is something that still resonates today.
Yeah.
Even if we're still figuring out the best way to put it into practice.
Okay, so we've established that Athenian democracy, while far from perfect, had some pretty radical ideas about citizen power. But here's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
If those ideas were so great, why'd their system eventually crumble?
Well, it turns out even democracies can have a shelf life, especially when faced with challenges from within and outside.
Right.
The episode paints a pretty vivid picture of Athens in the latter half of the 5th century BC. They're embroiled in the Peloponnesian War with Sparta, their resources are stretched thin,
Right.
and there's this growing sense of uncertainty and fear.
Sound familiar?
Exactly.
Yeah, it's giving me major here we go again vibes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And what happens, people start looking for someone to blame, someone to lead them out of the darkness. Enter the demagogues, charismatic figures who capitalize on the chaos and exploit people's fears to gain power.
Yeah.
One example the episode highlights is Alcibiades, a brilliant but ultimately self-serving Athenian general who managed to rise to prominence during this tumultuous period.
So it's like that saying, never let a good crisis go to waste, right?
Unfortunately, yes.
Okay.
And that's a pattern we see repeated throughout history.
Right.
When times get tough, it's easy to fall prey to those who promise simple solutions to complex problems, often at the expense of democratic norms and institutions.
It's scary how relevant that feels to today's world. We might not be fighting Sparta, but with everything from climate change to economic instability, it feels like there's no shortage of crises for modern-day demagogues to exploit.
Absolutely. And the episode makes another chillingly relevant point.
Okay.
One of the key factors in Athens' downfall was the erosion of what the ancient Greeks called civic virtue.
Civic virtue? That sounds pretty important. What exactly does that mean?
It's basically the idea that citizens have a responsibility to put the common good above their own self-interest.
Okay.
It's about participating in government, engaging in respectful debate,
Right.
and being willing to compromise for the sake of the community.
So the glue that holds a democracy together.
Exactly. But the episode argues that in the later years of Athenian democracy, that glue started to weaken.
Okay.
People became more focused on personal gain, factions arose,
Right.
and trust in their institutions dwindled. This created the perfect environment for someone like Alcibiades to exploit and ultimately contributed to Athens' downfall.
Wow. It's a sobering thought. And it makes you wonder, are we seeing a similar decline in civic virtue today?
It's a question worth considering.
Mm-hmm.
The episode definitely suggests that the challenges facing Athenian democracy,
Okay.
political polarization, economic inequality, a decline in civic engagement,
Yeah.
bear a striking resemblance to the challenges facing many democracies today. But there's another layer to this whole thing, that the Athenians never had to deal with the digital age.
Oh, right. The whole reason this whole conversation felt so relevant in the first place.
Right.
The internet, social media, it's like a whole new battleground for democracy, isn't it?
Exactly. The Athenian Agora, that marketplace of ideas we talked about earlier,
Right.
was limited by physical space and time.
Yeah.
Today, anyone with an internet connection can access a virtually limitless public square where information, misinformation, and opinions spread like wildfire.
It's almost too much to wrap your head around sometimes.
And it makes the challenges of Athenian democracy seem almost quaint in comparison. The speed and reach of online platforms create a whole new set of challenges. The spread of misinformation, echo chambers, the ability to manipulate public opinion on a massive scale. It's enough to make anyone wonder if democracy as we know it can survive in this digital age.
So we've gone from the lively debates of the Athenian Agora to today's digital public square where things move at warp speed. It feels like we're facing some pretty unprecedented challenges to democracy.
It's true. But the episode reminds us that this isn't the first time democracy has faced a crisis. Think about it. Athenian democracy rose, flourished, and ultimately fell, all within a relatively short span of time.
Right.
And yet, those core ideas about citizen power and self-governance, they didn't disappear entirely, did they?
It's like those ideas took root and spread, even if they've taken different forms in different places and times.
Exactly. And that's where things get really interesting, because the episode argues that we're not just passive observers in this story of democracy. We're active participants.
Right.
And the choices we make today will determine whether democracy thrives or withers in the digital age.
Okay, so no pressure then. But seriously, where do we even begin?
Well, the episode suggests that one crucial step is to remember that democracy is a verb, not a noun.
I love that. It's not just a system, it's an ongoing process that requires constant tending.
Exactly. And just like those Athenian citizens gathering in the Agora, we need to be actively engaged in the big conversations of our time, even when, maybe especially when they're difficult or uncomfortable.
Easier said than done in today's world, right? Where do you even start a productive conversation when everyone seems so divided?
That's a challenge the Athenians also faced, with their various factions and competing interests. But the episode highlights one key difference.
Okay.
In ancient Athens, debate and deliberation were seen as essential to a healthy democracy. Today, they're often mistaken for weakness, or even worse, a betrayal of one side.
It's like we've lost the art of disagreeing constructively, of finding common ground amidst our differences.
And that's a muscle we need to start exercising again. Because the episode argues that the only way to counter the forces of apathy, polarization, and misinformation is to rebuild a culture of informed, engaged, and yes, even sometimes contentious, civic participation.
So basically, we need to channel our inner Athenian citizen, but with better Wi-Fi.
Right.
It does feel that way sometimes.
But in all seriousness, the episode leaves us with this powerful message. The future of democracy in the digital age hinges on our ability to harness the power of connection and information for good. It's about recognizing our shared humanity, even perhaps especially when we disagree. And it's about remembering that the responsibility for safeguarding democracy rests not with some distant authority, but with each and every one of us.
It's a lot to think about, but it's also strangely empowering, isn't it? Knowing that we have a role to play in shaping the future of democracy. So, as we wrap up this deep dive into the world of Athenian democracy and its surprising relevance to our modern lives, here's my big takeaway. Let's keep those conversations going. Let's be engaged citizens. Let's be the change we want to see in the world. And who knows, maybe, just maybe, we can learn from the mistakes of the past and create a future where democracy in all its messy and evolving forms can truly thrive